The dark story of the plantation owner who bred slaves with his own daughters begins not with a whisper, but with the cold, hard fact of rusted metal found buried in the Georgia soil. In 1832, Abner Hollings ruled his Chatham County estate like a god, obsessed with a perverse vision of his family's bloodline. This macabre mystery, hidden for over a century, details a sinister crime where the walls of a home became a prison for his own children, Clara and Annabeth. What happened within that isolated kingdom, a place of torment and secrets, was a truth so horrific that it had to be erased by the land itself. The official records speak only of a tragic disappearance, but the discovery of a hidden diary poses a chilling question. What truly became of the man who vanished into the swamp? And what justice did the tormented souls he left behind finally claim for themselves? This is the case of Hollingswood Plantation, a story of buried secrets and the silent testimony of those who refused to be forgotten. Before we unearth the terrible truth recorded in these forgotten pages, we invite you to become part of our community of historical investigators. Subscribe to Before the Story and enable all notifications so you never miss an expedition into the past's darkest corners. If you believe that history's most difficult stories are the ones that most need to be told, please take a moment to like this video. Your support allows us to continue these deep dives into the archives. And now, let us know in the comments from what part of the world you are joining us to uncover this story tonight. The narrative begins in the summer of 1994, amidst the humid, oppressive air of Chatham County, Georgia. A tract of land, once the heart of the infamous Hollingswood Plantation, was being cleared for a new housing development. The work was routine, the earth surrendering its history of cotton and sorrow with mechanical indifference. It was during the excavation of an outbuilding's foundation, a structure long since collapsed into the soil, that a backhoe operator's machine struck something solid. It was not a stone, but a rotted cypress beam, and nestled within its hollowed core was a small tin box, its seams sealed tight with blackened brittle wax. This was the first breadcrumb leading back to a forgotten American horror. Inside that box, preserved from the moisture and the passage of 162 years, lay a small, leather-bound diary. Its pages were filled with the elegant, looping script of a young woman who had lived a life of gilded terror. The ink had faded to a ghostly brown, but the words retained their power, their urgency, their chilling clarity. This was the voice of Clara Hollings, the eldest daughter of the plantation's master, and her testimony would rewrite the official history of a family and a place that had seemingly vanished into the footnotes of local law. It was a record not of daily life, but of a calculated, systematic descent into a moral abyss. The first legible entry, dated May 11, 1832, sets a tone of profound and suffocating unease. It speaks not of courtship or social calls, but of a philosophical prison constructed by her own father. "Father says our blood is a fortress," she wrote, "and that I must be its vigilant guard. He speaks of purity, of a line stretching back through generations, a sacred trust I am sworn to protect. But he does not say who the enemy is, or from where the attack might come. I fear the enemy is already inside the walls." This entry establishes the central, suffocating theme of her existence. A duty without definition, a threat without a name, a fortress that felt more like a tomb. Hollingswood Plantation was, by all accounts, an isolated kingdom. Abner Hollings, its patriarch, was a man of considerable influence in Chatham County, yet he rarely participated in its social life. He was known for his obsessive control, his severe demeanor, and his fanatical devotion to the concept of legacy. He governed his 800 acres and the 74 enslaved souls who worked them with an iron will that tolerated no deviation. Visitors were infrequent, and those who did come spoke of a place that was unnervingly quiet. A house where silence was not a sign of peace, but of absolute, unquestioned authority. The manor house itself stood as a monument to this control, a stark white structure surrounded by ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss. It was a place of shadows and secrets, where the humid air seemed to cling to the walls, heavy with unspoken words. Here, Clara and her younger sister Annabeth lived in near-complete seclusion. They were educated by tutors, permitted no friendships beyond the estate's borders, and constantly shadowed by enslaved servants hand-picked by their father. They were the jewels of his dynasty, kept locked away in a display case of his own design, their lives a testament to his power. For the enslaved community at Hollingswood, this oppressive control manifested as a constant, low-grade terror. They understood the master's obsession with bloodlines in a way no outsider could. They saw it in the cold, assessing way he would study the children born in the cabins, in the quiet, unrecorded sales that followed the birth of any infant deemed impure. They knew that any perceived act of defiance, any word spoken out of turn, could lead to a silent final journey to the cypress swamp that bordered the western edge of the property, a place from which no one ever returned. The official records of Chatham County from that era paint a picture of Abner Hollings as a shrewd and successful planter, a man of discipline and vision. His cotton yields were consistent, his accounts were in order, and his name was associated with stability. There is no hint in these public documents of the dark secret that festered at the heart of his estate. The truth was not a matter for public record. It was a private religion, a domestic creed of which he was the sole prophet and his family the first unwilling disciples. Clara's diary, therefore, is not just a personal account. It is a counter-narrative, a secret history written from within the sanctum of the oppressor. It is the only surviving record of the true nature of the Hollingswood experiment. Her elegant script, so at odds with the horror she describes, becomes the primary source document for a crime that had been successfully erased from history. It is a voice from the grave, demanding to be heard, a story of a family's dark, sinister secret that refused to remain buried forever. The opening pages of her journal lay the foundation for this macabre mystery. She describes the suffocating routines, the scripted conversations, the weight of her father's constant analytical gaze. He was not a father in the conventional sense. He was a geneticist, a warden, and the architect of their isolation. Her words paint a portrait of a young woman acutely aware of the wrongness of her world, yet powerless to name it. The diary was her only confidant, the only space where she could articulate the creeping horror of her existence, a horror that was about to find a new and unexpected catalyst. The meticulously controlled ecosystem of Hollingswood was predicated on the absolute subjugation of every soul within its borders, a world where every variable was managed by its master. The first documented anomaly to this oppressive order is recorded in Clara Hollings's diary on June 7, 1832. This entry marks the arrival of a new purchase, an enslaved man named Nathaniel, acquired from a Virginia estate sale to replace a field hand lost to fever. His arrival should have been unremarkable, another cog fitted into Abner's machine. But from the very first moment, Clara's writing reveals that he was something different, an element her father had not anticipated. She describes the scene with the detached precision of a naturalist observing a new species. The wagon pulls up before the main house, an unusual honor reserved only for those destined for domestic service. She notes his physical presence, tall, lean, with hands that seem too skilled for field work, but her focus is on his eyes. In a world where survival depended on a downcast gaze, Nathaniel's was direct, steady, and unnervingly observant. It was a gaze that did not plead or defy, but simply saw. It was the look of a man who was captive, but not captured. "He does not look broken," Clara writes, her words underlined twice for emphasis. "Father noticed it too. I saw the displeasure in his eyes, a tightening at the corners of his mouth. He said to the overseer, 'That one will need a firm hand to learn his place.'" The words were a threat, but they felt like something else as well, a recognition. It was as if two kings, one enthroned and one in chains, were measuring each other for the first time. I feel this is a test, but I do not know for whom. This passage is critical. It establishes Nathaniel not as a passive victim, but as a quiet, opposing force whose very presence challenges the foundation of Abner's power. The anomaly of Nathaniel's character is further explored in the entries that follow. He performs his assigned duties with quiet competence, never giving cause for punishment, yet he moves with an economy of motion and a self-containment that sets him apart. The other enslaved people react to him with a mixture of fear and respect. They sense, as Clara does, that he is not like them. He is a man who carries his past within him, not as a burden of scars, but as a source of hidden strength. His silence is not born of submission, but of careful, deliberate observation. Abner Hollings, a master of reading fear and weakness, seems unable to find a purchase on Nathaniel's character. Clara documents several instances where her father attempts to provoke a reaction, a sudden, harsh command, an impossible task assigned at dusk, a deliberate, humiliating remark made in front of others. Each time, Nathaniel responds with the same unnerving calm, his expression unreadable, his compliance absolute, but devoid of the terror Abner feeds upon. This failure to break him becomes a source of visible frustration for the master of Hollingswood. For Clara, Nathaniel becomes an object of intense secret study. Trapped in her own gilded cage, she sees in him a form of freedom she cannot comprehend. It is the freedom of an unbroken spirit, an internal sovereignty that exists beyond the reach of chains and whips. She begins to watch him from her window, noting his interactions, his moments of quiet solitude, the way he seems to absorb the rhythms of the plantation without being absorbed by them. He is a mystery, a puzzle that her carefully curated education has not prepared her to solve. The true significance of his arrival, however, lies in how it begins to alter Clara's perception of her own world. His quiet dignity throws the grotesque servility of her own life into sharp relief. His unbroken gaze makes her more aware of the fear in everyone else's eyes, including her own and her sister's. He is a mirror reflecting the true nature of their prison, and the reflection is more terrifying than the prison itself. He is not merely an anomaly, he is a catalyst, a silent agent of change whose presence has begun to subtly shift the oppressive atmosphere of the plantation. Clara's diary entries from this period are filled with a new kind of tension. Her descriptions of the suffocating routines are now interspersed with brief, almost furtive observations of Nathaniel. He has become a focal point for her own burgeoning awareness, a symbol of a world beyond the one her father has constructed. The fear that has dominated her life begins to mingle with a new, unfamiliar emotion, a dangerous and intoxicating curiosity. She is beginning to see the cracks in the fortress walls. The entry for June 21st captures this shift perfectly. After describing a tense dinner where her father pontificated on the natural order of masters and slaves, she adds a final, telling sentence. "Tonight, I saw the new man, Nathaniel, watching the house from the edge of the fields as the sun went down. He was not looking at the house as a servant does, with fear or resentment. He was looking at it as a strategist might study a map before a battle. For the first time, I felt a tremor of something that was not fear. It was hope." Détil. Over the ensuing months, from the oppressive heat of summer into the cooler, melancholic days of autumn, Clara's diary transforms from a record of personal dread into a clandestine ledger of her father's crimes. Empowered by the silent anomaly of Nathaniel's presence, she begins to document the sinister patterns of life at Hollingswood with a new, terrifying clarity. Her observations become more focused, her interpretations more damning. She is no longer just a victim. She is a secret historian, compiling the evidence that will condemn the king of this isolated, macabre kingdom. Her entries detail Abner's late-night visitations to the slave cabins with chilling regularity. She notes the dates, the times, and the specific quarters he approaches, almost always those housing the youngest and most vulnerable women. These are not recorded as acts of random cruelty, but as methodical, calculated inspections. He is not a man driven by passion, but by a chillingly rational design. Clara writes of lying awake in her bed, listening to the crunch of his boots on the gravel path, a sound that has become the nocturnal heartbeat of her family's dark secret. The diary becomes a chronicle of the unsanctioned expansion of his lineage. Clara begins to keep a secret tally of the children born in the quarters, noting their physical characteristics with a painful, meticulous eye. She records the birth of a boy with hair the color of corn silk, a girl with eyes the pale, misty grey of her own sister's. These children, living proof of her father's transgressions, are never allowed to remain at Hollingswood for long. Their existence is a flaw in his narrative of purity, a contradiction that must be erased. The process of this erasure is documented with cold precision. Clara records the arrival of unfamiliar wagons in the dead of night, the hushed, tense conversations between her father and grim-faced men from distant counties. She notes the subsequent disappearance of a mother and her too fair child, their names simply vanishing from the plantation's oral record. The official explanation is always the same: they were sold to a new master in the West. But Clara and the enslaved community know the truth. These are not sales, they are purges. In stark contrast to this systematic horror, Clara documents Nathaniel's growing influence within the enslaved community. He has become a silent center of gravity. She observes him sharing his meager rations with a hungry child, using his knowledge of herbal remedies to tend to the sick, offering a quiet word of comfort to a woman whose child has just disappeared. These are not grand acts of rebellion, but small, powerful affirmations of a shared humanity that her father's regime seeks to obliterate. He is building an invisible network of trust and loyalty, one quiet act at a time. The tension between these two opposing forces, Abner's systematic dehumanization and Nathaniel's quiet rehumanization, becomes the central drama of Clara's diary. She describes seeing Nathaniel in the fields, leading a work song that seems to give the laborers a new strength, a new rhythm. The overseer, a man named Peters, reports to her father that Nathaniel is a good worker, but that he has a calming effect on the others that is somehow more unsettling than open defiance. A calm slave is an unreadable slave, and an unreadable slave is a dangerous one. This accumulation of evidence begins to take a visible toll on Clara. Her entries speak of sleepless nights, of a growing distance from her sister Annabeth, who refuses to acknowledge the truth that is unfolding before them. Annabeth retreats further into a world of feigned ignorance, clinging to the fragile shell of their privileged lives, while Clara is being slowly consumed by the terrible knowledge she is compiling. The diary becomes her only sanity, the only place where the world as she sees it is real. Her writing style shifts. The earlier, more introspective passages give way to stark, factual accounts. She is no longer merely expressing her fear. She is building a case. The dates, the names, the descriptions of the children, it all reads like testimony, a prosecutor's notes for a trial that may never happen. She is arming herself with the truth, turning her father's most protected secret into a weapon that she does not yet know how to wield. One particular entry from late August encapsulates this transformation. After documenting the disappearance of a young woman named Sarah and her infant son, she writes, not of sorrow, but of cold, calculating rage. He does not even use their names. They are listed in his ledgers as Asset 43 and Issue. He believes he can erase them from the world by erasing them from his books, but I have written their names here, Sarah, and the boy, Samuel. I will not let them be forgotten. This book will remember. Nay, the line between suspicion and certainty is often a single shattering moment of revelation. For Clara Hollings, that moment is recorded in her diary on September 5th, 1832. It is the day her accumulated evidence, her furtive observations, and the whispered truths of the enslaved community coalesce into a single, undeniable hypothesis. The monster she has been documenting is not just a cruel master, he is the architect of a deliberate, perverse, and ongoing crime against his own bloodline, a sinister truth that redefines the very meaning of family. The catalyst is a seemingly minor event. A young enslaved boy, no more than 8 years old, is accused of stealing a biscuit from the kitchen. Clara witnesses her father drag the child out into the yard for public punishment. As Abner raises his hand to strike the boy, the child looks up, his face a mask of terror, streaked with dirt and tears, and in that instant, Clara sees it. It is not a fleeting resemblance, but a perfect, horrifying echo of her father's own features. She describes the moment with a strange, detached horror, as if she is observing a scientific specimen. When the boy looked up, she writes, his face stained with tears and dirt, I saw my father's jawline. I saw the precise shape of his eyes. It was like looking at a distorted reflection in dark water, a caricature of the face I see every day at the dinner table, the whispers of the older servants, the ones I always dismissed as spiteful gossip. They are not malice, they are truth. This is the moment the final veil is torn away. Her hypothesis, which she articulates for the first time in the pages that follow, is as simple as it is monstrous. Her father's obsession with the purity of the Hollings bloodline is a lie, a carefully constructed facade to mask its opposite. He is not protecting his lineage, he is propagating it, seeding his own features among the enslaved population. The children he sells away are not the ones deemed impure, but the ones whose resemblance to him is too obvious, too dangerous to his carefully crafted narrative. This new understanding recasts every memory, every observation in a new and terrible light. The late-night visits to the cabins are no longer just acts of power, but of calculated insemination. The unrecorded sales are not just purges, but the frantic pruning of a family tree that is growing in the wrong direction. His obsession with his daughter's seclusion takes on a new, more sinister meaning. He is not protecting them from the world, he is isolating them to be the pristine, official branch of a lineage whose roots run deep into the forbidden soil of the slave quarters. Clara's diary entry continues, her mind racing to connect the dots. This fortress of blood he speaks of is a prison, she concludes, and he is the jailer of us all. He keeps us, his white daughters, as the public face of his legacy, while he cultivates a secret second family in the shadows. We are the ornaments on the mantelpiece, but his true legacy is in the fields, in the cabins, in the faces of the children he creates and then casts into the wilderness. Now, this is the central, horrifying thesis of the Hollingswood experiment. The moral and spiritual implications of this discovery are staggering, and Clara grapples with them in the pages of her diary. She questions the nature of her own identity, her own purity. If her father's blood is the source of this corruption, what does that make her? Is she too tainted by his sin? The very foundation of her world, the belief in the sanctity of her family and her station, has crumbled into dust, leaving her standing in the ruins of a monstrous lie. This hypothesis also explains her father's strange, obsessive need to control every aspect of their lives. It is the frantic effort of a man trying to maintain two separate, contradictory realities. He must be both the paragon of southern aristocracy and a secret practitioner of the very racial mixing his class so publicly abhors. The pressure of maintaining this duality explains his tyrannical nature, his violent outbursts, his deep-seated paranoia. He is at war with himself, and his family and his slaves are the casualties of that internal conflict. The discovery fundamentally changes Clara's relationship with the enslaved people of Hollingswood. She no longer sees them merely as victims of her father's cruelty, but as her kin, a shadow family bound to her by the same blood that flows in her own veins. The boy in the yard is not just a slave, he is her brother. The young women in the cabins are not just property, they are the unwilling matriarchs of a hidden branch of the Hollings family. This realization forges a new, dangerous and unspoken bond between them. The entry of September 5th ends with a sentence that marks a profound shift in her character. The fear is still there, but it is now overshadowed by a cold, righteous anger. Her purpose is no longer simply to survive, but to bear witness. He is not a master, she writes. He is a plague, and this book, this secret history, will be the record of his sins. I do not know what justice is, or if it can even exist in a world like this. But I know this: the truth must be written down. It is the only weapon I have. The weight of a terrible truth can either forge a bond or shatter it. For Clara and Annabeth Hollings, their father's monstrous secret becomes a chasm that divides them, turning their shared prison into two separate, isolated cells. Clara's diary entries from the autumn of 1832 become a painful record of this social fracture, a chronicle of a sisterhood collapsing under the pressure of a truth one has embraced and the other desperately denies. The carefully constructed facade of the Hollings family, already a lie to the outside world, begins to disintegrate from within. Armed with her horrifying hypothesis, Clara feels compelled to share it with the only other person who shares her gilded cage. She confronts Annabeth, her younger, more fragile sister, in the seclusion of their shared sitting room. She lays out her suspicions, the evidence of the boy in the yard, the whispers of the servants, the meaning of their father's late-night walks. She expects shock, horror, perhaps even a shared desire for action. Instead, she is met with a wall of pure, unadulterated terror. Annabeth's reaction, as documented by Clara, is not one of disbelief, but of willful denial. She refuses to listen, her hands covering her ears, her eyes wide with a panic that borders on hysteria. "She told me to burn these pages," Clara writes, her handwriting shaky with a mixture of frustration and sorrow. "She hissed at me, her voice a terrified whisper. Some truths are poison, Clara, and we are already dying." She believes that to name the evil is to give it power, that our only hope for survival lies in our silence. This moment marks the beginning of their estrangement. The fracture deepens in the days that follow. Annabeth begins to avoid Clara, taking her meals in her room, finding excuses to be elsewhere when Clara enters a room. The easy intimacy they once shared, their only solace in a life of isolation, is replaced by a tense, fearful silence. Annabeth now looks at Clara not as a sister, but as a threat. In her eyes, Clara's newfound knowledge is a dangerous contagion that could bring their father's wrath down upon them both. She has chosen the devil she knows over the terrifying uncertainty of the truth. Clara's diary entries become a lament for her lost sister. She describes Annabeth's desperate attempts to maintain a semblance of normalcy, her forced, cheerful conversations with their father at the dinner table, her renewed interest in her needlepoint and her music. These are the frantic actions of a person trying to rebuild the walls of her prison after they have been breached. Annabeth is not just denying the truth, she is actively working to suppress it, to bury it under a mountain of trivialities. This internal schism has a profound effect on Clara. The one person she thought she could count on has abandoned her, leaving her utterly alone with her terrible secret. Her isolation is now complete. She is a prisoner not only of her father's design, but of her own consciousness. This deepens her silent, desperate reliance on Nathaniel. He becomes the only other person at Hollingswood who seems to see the world as it truly is. His steady, observant presence is a silent affirmation that she is not going mad. The social fracture also manifests in Clara's relationship with her father. Now that she understands the true nature of his obsession, his every word, his every gesture is laden with a new, grotesque meaning. When he speaks of family honor, she hears the echo of his hypocrisy. When he praises her for her purity, she feels the chill of his predatory design. She learns to mask her revulsion behind a facade of demure obedience, becoming a consummate actress in the grim theater of her family's life. The diary entries from this period are a study in psychological survival. Clara describes the immense effort it takes to maintain this facade, the constant, exhausting vigilance required to hide her true thoughts. She lives in a state of perpetual performance, her outward self a carefully constructed fiction designed to placate her jailer. The diary is the only place she can be her true self, the only place she can voice the rage and the horror that are consuming her. The entry for October 12th is particularly poignant. After a tense evening during which her father praised Annabeth for her sweet, untroubled spirit, Clara retreats to her room and writes, "He praises her for her blindness. He cultivates her ignorance as he cultivates his cotton. Tonight I realize that Annabeth is not just my sister. She is his greatest creation, a daughter who has been taught to love the very chains that bind her. He has not just imprisoned her body, he has colonized her soul, and in his eyes I am a failed crop, a plant that has grown toward a light he tried to extinguish." A person can live with a hypothesis, however horrifying, but irrefutable proof changes everything. It transforms suspicion into knowledge, and knowledge demands action. The moment of irrefutable proof for Clara Hollings comes not from her own investigation, but as a final, desperate confession from the sister who had abandoned her. It is an act of guilt and terror that provides Clara with the one thing she lacked, a tangible record of her father's sins, a weapon forged by the very victim he had sought to silence most completely, his own wife. The catalyst for this revelation is Annabeth's own psychological collapse, the strain of her willful ignorance, of living a lie in the face of Clara's silent, knowing gaze, becomes too much to bear. One night, in a state of near-total hysteria, she comes to Clara's room, her face pale and tear-streaked in the candlelight. She is tormented not by what Clara has told her, but by what she has always known and refused to admit, a secret she has been carrying since childhood. With trembling hands, Annabeth leads Clara not to the library or their father's study, but to the small, disused sewing room at the back of the second floor. Their mother's room, a space that has been kept locked since her death years before. The air inside is stale, thick with the scent of dust and faded lavender. Annabeth goes to a corner of the room, pries up a loose floorboard with a letter opener, and pulls out a small wooden box. Inside are two more books, ledgers bound in the same dark leather as her father's official plantation accounts. These are not records of household expenses. They are the secret ledgers of Eleanor Hollings, their deceased mother. With a meticulous, almost scientific precision, she had created a secret genealogy, a counter-narrative to her husband's public legacy. The first ledger contains the names of every enslaved person on the plantation. The second contains a list of every child born in the slave quarters, going back 15 years. Beside each name is a series of coded symbols, a secret language of sorrow and witness. Clara's diary describes the moment she deciphers the code with a cold, almost clinical clarity. A small star indicates the child's mother, a date indicates the birth, and a simple damning set of initials, A.H., appears next to the names of no fewer than 17 children. It is not a suspicion, it is a meticulously kept record of conquest, a chronicle of her mother's silent, horrifying vigil. The proof is absolute, undeniable, and written in her own mother's hand. This discovery has a profound and immediate impact on Clara. The last vestiges of fear are burned away, replaced by a hardened, chilling resolve. The horror is no longer an abstract concept. It is a physical artifact, a tangible piece of evidence she can hold in her hands. Her father is no longer just a monster in her mind. He is a criminal whose crimes have been documented by his own wife. The moral weight of this new knowledge is immense, but it is also liberating. She is no longer just a witness. She is the custodian of a verdict. Her diary entry from that night is stark and declarative. "It was not a hypothesis," she writes. "It was a final accounting. My mother did not die of a sudden fever, as father has always claimed. I see that now. She died of this knowledge, consumed by a truth she could not speak, but could not bear to let be forgotten. These books were her final act, her only rebellion, and she has left them to me, her daughter, to finish what she could not." The document transforms her grief into a solemn, sacred duty. The discovery also recasts her understanding of Annabeth. Her sister's terror is not the product of weakness, but of a shared, suppressed trauma. Annabeth confesses that their mother had shown her the ledgers once, years ago, in a moment of desperate, whispered confidence, swearing her to secrecy. Annabeth had been too young to fully understand, but the memory had festered within her, a source of lifelong, unnamed dread. Her denial was not a rejection of Clara, but a desperate attempt to keep a promise made to a dead woman. This shared secret, this terrible inheritance, begins to mend the fracture between the two sisters. They are no longer divided by what they know, but united by it. Annabeth's terror is slowly replaced by a fragile, tentative trust in Clara. She does not have Clara's strength, but she is no longer an obstacle. She is a silent, fearful co-conspirator, her fate now inextricably linked to her sister's. The family has been broken and reformed around a new, terrible nucleus, the truth contained in their mother's ledgers. The possession of irrefutable truth is a profound transfer of power. For Clara Hollings, her mother's secret ledgers do not just confirm her father's crimes, they dismantle the very foundation of his authority. He is still the master of Hollingswood, a figure of immense physical power, but he has lost his psychological hold over his eldest daughter. Abner Hollings, the god of his small kingdom, is reduced in Clara's eyes to a mere man, a deeply flawed, predictable, and ultimately vulnerable man. This collapse of his authority, documented in her diary, marks the beginning of the end. Clara's perspective, as recorded in her entries, shifts from that of a victim to that of a strategist. She no longer sees her father as an omnipresent force of nature, but as a subject to be studied, a problem to be solved. She begins to observe him with a cold, analytical detachment, noting his habits, his routines, his vanities, and most importantly, his weaknesses. She documents his profound, almost primal fear of storms, a detail she had once dismissed as a mere eccentricity. She notes his obsessive pride, his absolute refusal to admit weakness or delegate authority, especially when his property is involved. This new perspective allows her to move through the house with a newfound sense of purpose. Her fear has not vanished, but it has been transmuted into a focused, calculating energy. She is no longer just surviving, she is planning. The diary becomes less a record of her suffering and more a strategic journal, a place to map out her father's vulnerabilities and formulate a plan of action. The power dynamic within the walls of Hollingswood has inverted, a silent, secret revolution known only to her. The most critical step in this new phase is the establishment of a secure line of communication with Nathaniel. The risk is enormous, but Clara understands that she cannot act alone. She needs an ally who can operate outside the confines of the main house, someone who has the trust of the enslaved community and the courage to act. She begins to leave coded messages for him, tucked into the spine of a book she knows he is tasked with dusting in the parlor, a volume of Stoic philosophy that now seems a bitter irony. Her first message is a single cryptic line from Scripture, a test of his literacy and his courage. "The truth shall make you free." The next day, she finds the book replaced on the shelf, a single pressed wildflower marking the page. It is a sign of receipt, a quiet acknowledgement. A channel has been opened. Through a series of these carefully planned indirect exchanges, she begins to share the truth she has discovered, feeding him information about the ledgers, about her father's patterns, about the true nature of his crimes. Nathaniel's role in this new dynamic is crucial. He becomes her eyes and ears in the quarters, confirming the stories of the disappeared women and children, identifying those within the community who can be trusted. He operates with a quiet, methodical patience, never betraying his intentions. He understands that a premature move, a single misstep, would bring catastrophic consequences down upon them all. He is the pragmatist to her righteous fury, the calm, steady hand that will guide their dangerous plan. The collapse of Abner's authority is also evident in the way Clara begins to subtly manipulate the household. She uses her position as the mistress of the house to create opportunities, to move pawns on the chessboard. She might send a trusted servant on an errand that allows Nathaniel a moment of privacy, or feign a headache to avoid a family dinner, creating a diversion. These are small, almost imperceptible acts of sabotage, tiny cracks she is creating in the edifice of her father's control. Her diary entries from this period reflect a mind that is clear, focused, and terrifyingly lucid. The emotional turmoil of the previous months has given way to a cold, hard sense of purpose. She's no longer grappling with the horror of her discovery. She's weaponizing it. She understands that true justice, the kind meted out by courts and magistrates, is an impossibility. The system is designed to protect men like her father. The only justice available to them is the kind they can make for themselves. The final entry in this section reveals the full extent of this psychological shift. After a week of silent, coded communication with Nathaniel, she writes not of fear or hope, but of cold, hard logistics. He understands. He knows the names from the ledger. He says the elders have their own records, kept not in ink, but in memory. The two histories match. The authority of my father is a fiction propped up by fear and ignorance. We have the truth. Now, we must find a way to make the truth matter. While Clara possessed the documented proof of her father's crimes, the path to any form of justice remained blocked. The ledgers were a weapon without a means of deployment. It was Nathaniel who, through his own clandestine investigation, discovered the hidden source that would transform their moral certainty into a practical, terrifying plan. This source was not a document, but a place, a living, breathing entity with a history of its own. The cypress swamp that bordered the western edge of the plantation, a place known to the enslaved as the Hollings Mire. Nathaniel, having gained the trust of the plantation's oldest residents, began to listen to their stories, the oral histories that were never meant for the master's ears. He sought out an elderly woman named Hetty, a midwife and herbalist whose family had been enslaved at Hollingswood for 3 generations. Hetty was the keeper of the community's collective memory, a living archive of the plantation's secrets. She knew the truth not from ledgers, but from the empty spaces left behind by those who had disappeared. Hetty spoke to Nathaniel of the swamp. To the white inhabitants of the county, it was a useless, treacherous backwater, a place to be avoided. But to the enslaved, it was a place of profound and terrible significance. It was the final destination for those who defied Abner Hollings, the place where his mistakes and his rages were buried. But Hetty also knew the swamp's other secrets. She knew its hidden paths, its secret logics, and its deceptive, deadly traps. She revealed to Nathaniel the existence of what she called false bottoms. These were patches of earth, often covered with a deceptive layer of solid-looking vegetation that were in fact deep, sucking peat bogs. A man could walk onto one, believing it to be solid ground, and be swallowed whole in a matter of minutes, pulled down into the anoxic depths where a body could be preserved for centuries, hidden from the world. Hetty and her ancestors had mapped these places in their minds, a secret geography of survival. This knowledge, communicated back to Clara through their covert system, was a revelation. The swamp, which had always been a symbol of her father's ultimate terrifying power, the place where he could make people disappear, was suddenly recontextualized. It was not just an instrument of his will, it was a neutral, natural force that could be turned against him. The source of their greatest fear could become the instrument of their liberation. Clara's diary entry upon receiving this information is electric, with a new, dangerous energy. Hetty calls it the mire, she writes. Nathaniel drew me a map on a scrap of paper, which I burned after memorizing. He has marked the safe paths and the false ones. Hetty told him the land has a long memory. It does not forget the blood it has been fed. For the first time, I see a path forward, a way to end this without firing a shot, without a single witness. We will not be the agents of justice. We will simply lead the guilty man to a courtroom from which there is no appeal. This discovery of the swamp's hidden nature provides the final critical piece of their plan. It offers a method of disposal that is both untraceable and poetically just. Abner Hollings, a man who had used the swamp to erase his victims, would himself be erased by it. His disappearance would be attributed to a natural accident, a tragic misstep in a treacherous landscape. There would be no trial, no public scandal, no risk of exposure for Clara, Annabeth, or the enslaved people who helped them. The plan begins to take shape in Clara's diary, a chilling fusion of her insider knowledge of her father's psychology and Nathaniel's practical knowledge of the land. They would need a lure, a reason for Abner to venture into the swamp alone, consumed by a rage that would override his caution. They would need a moment of chaos to provide cover for their actions. And they would need to trust in the ancient, impartial power of the land itself to deliver the final verdict. The discovery of this hidden source elevates the story from a tale of domestic horror to something more primal, more elemental. The conflict is no longer just between a daughter and her father, or between the enslaved and their master. It is now a conflict between a man who seeks to impose his will upon nature and nature itself. The swamp becomes a character in the drama, a silent, patient observer that is about to play its final, decisive role. Providence, or perhaps mere coincidence, provided the final catalyst. A weather report, brought back from a supply run to Savannah, predicted a major coastal storm was tracking up the Georgia coast, set to make landfall within a matter of days. For the residents of Chatham County, it was a cause for concern, a time to secure homes and protect livestock. But for Clara Hollings and Nathaniel, the approaching storm was a signal, a divine or natural endorsement of the terrible plan they had been formulating. The chaos of the wind and the rain would be the perfect cover for their act of final, silent justice. Clara's diary entry for October 29, 1832 is no longer a record of emotion, but a cold, dispassionate blueprint for retribution. It is a document of chilling clarity, outlining the steps of their plan with the precision of a military strategist. The storm would provide the necessary distraction, its fury masking their movements, its aftermath explaining any unusual tracks or disturbances. The moment for decisive action had arrived, and there was no hesitation in her written words, only a sense of grim, inevitable purpose. The plan, as justified in her source, was elegantly simple and psychologically astute. They would use her father's greatest weakness, his obsessive pride in his twisted lineage, as the bait. The lure would be the young boy with his father's eyes, the same child whose beating had first opened Clara's eyes to the truth. During the height of the storm, the boy would run, his flight staged to look like a desperate escape into the swamp. A torn piece of his shirt would be left on a branch, a clear sign of his path. Clara's justification for this action is rooted in her absolute certainty of her father's reaction. She writes, "He will not send the overseer. He will not send a tracking party. This boy, this living evidence of his hypocrisy, is a matter of personal, private shame. He will not risk anyone else finding him, hearing his story. He will go himself, consumed by a fury that will blind him to all else. He will trust no one but himself to reclaim his property and silence the truth. His pride will be his undoing." She had studied her jailer well, and she knew exactly which levers to pull. The preparations are detailed with a cold, methodical focus. Nathaniel would be the one to mark the false path, using a series of broken branches to guide Abner toward the most treacherous part of the Hollings mire. The boy and his mother would be hidden in a secret cellar beneath the old smokehouse, to be spirited away to a community of free blacks near Savannah once the deed was done. Hetty, the old woman who knew the swamp's secrets, would be the one to raise the alarm, her feigned panic timed perfectly to send Abner charging into the storm. There is a profound sense of moral clarity in Clara's writing. She expresses no guilt, no remorse for the action they are about to take. In her eyes, this is not murder. It is an act of sanitation, a lancing of a boil that has poisoned every life at Hollingswood. It is the only path to freedom, not just for herself and Annabeth, but for the dozens of enslaved people living under her father's reign of terror, and for the generations of children he would have continued to produce and discard. The role of Annabeth in this final act is one of passive, terrified compliance. Clara writes that her sister has locked herself in her room, praying with a fervor that is born more of terror than of faith. Annabeth is a silent partner in the conspiracy, her silence a form of consent. She will not help, but she will not hinder. She has surrendered her agency to her older sister, trusting that Clara's terrible resolve is their only hope for salvation. The diary entry serves as a final testament, a justification for an act that will forever remain a secret. Clara seems to be writing not just for herself, but for a future audience, a court of posterity that might one day unearth her story. She is laying out the case for the defense, explaining why this extreme measure was not a choice, but a necessity, the only logical conclusion to a life lived in the shadow of an absolute and corrupt power. The entry concludes with a sentence that resonates with the finality of a judge's gavel. The plan is set, the players are in position, and the storm is gathering on the horizon. There is no turning back. He believes he is a god in this small kingdom, a master of life and death, she writes, her script firm and unwavering. Tomorrow, we will introduce him to a power that is older and more impartial than his own. We will deliver him not to a judgment in the next world, but to the cold, dark judgment of this one. The climax of the Hollingswood saga is not a scene of overt violence or confrontation. It is a quiet, terrifying moment of calculated action, narrated entirely through the final frantic entry in Clara Hollings's diary. This last primary source, dated October 30th, 1832, is the only surviving eyewitness account of the events that transpired during the Great Storm. The handwriting is rushed, the ink is smeared in places by moisture, and the words carry the breathless immediacy of a story being written as it unfolds. It is a document that places the reader directly into the heart of the storm and the center of the conspiracy. The entry begins at dusk, with the storm descending upon the plantation in full fury. Clara describes the sound of the wind, a relentless shrieking howl that seems to be trying to tear the house from its foundations. The rain is a solid, horizontal sheet, blurring the world outside her window into a grey, chaotic watercolor. This is not just a backdrop for the action. It is an active participant, an agent of chaos that is both terrifying and welcome. The storm provides the perfect cloak for their terrible work, its natural violence mirroring the human drama about to unfold. She records the execution of the plan with short, sharp, declarative sentences. Hetty has raised the alarm. The boy is gone. The torn piece of cloth has been discovered on the path leading to the swamp. Her father's reaction is exactly as she predicted. His face is a mask of thunderous rage, his voice a low growl as he dismisses the overseer's offer to form a search party. He is a man possessed, driven by an egotistical fury that will not be delegated. He will handle this himself. The most powerful moment in the entry is her description of watching her father from her second-story window as he prepares to enter the storm. "He just left," she writes. He carried a single hooded lantern, its small, defiant flame already flickering against the wind. He was dressed for the hunt, his heavy oilskin coat pulled tight, his boots sinking into the mud. He did not look back at the house. He was entirely focused on the pursuit, on reclaiming what he believed was his. He looked powerful, indomitable, a king marching into battle. But I knew he was walking to his grave. The interpretation of this scene, filtered through Clara's words, is one of profound and terrible irony. Abner Hollings, the master of control, is at this moment completely controlled by his own pride and his own secrets. He believes he is acting as the ultimate authority, the master of his domain, but he is, in fact, a puppet. His movements dictated by a plan he cannot see, lured into a trap set by the very people he has subjugated. His strength is the source of his downfall. His authority is the instrument of his own execution. The diary entry continues as she waits, listening to the storm, her sister Annabeth weeping softly in the next room. The minutes stretch into an hour, then two. There is no triumphant cry, no sound of his return. There is only the unrelenting scream of the wind and the percussive drumming of the rain against the glass. The silence from the swamp is more damning than any sound could be. It is the sound of a conclusion, of a vacuum being created where a tyrant once stood. Clara does not speculate on the specific details of his end. She does not need to. The mechanism has been set in motion, and the outcome is inevitable. Whether he was pulled down in an instant or struggled for minutes against the cold, sucking embrace of the mire is irrelevant. The final judgment was not delivered by a human hand, but by the indifferent, ancient logic of the land itself. He has been consumed by the very darkness he used to hide his sins. The last lines of the diary are a raw, conflicted mixture of absolution and despair. The immediate threat is gone, but the stain of his actions, and her own, will remain forever. "The rain is washing away the world," she writes, the final words barely legible. "It is washing away the tracks, the evidence, the man himself. There is nothing left but the storm. God forgive me." Then, a final, chilling addendum, as if a second thought corrected the first. "No, God forgive us all." This final entry is the emotional and narrative climax of the story. It is a masterpiece of suspense, told not through what is seen, but through what is known and what is awaited. The horror is in the anticipation, in the quiet, methodical execution of a perfect, untraceable crime. The diary closes on this note of terrible finality. The story has been told, the secret has been recorded, and the book is now closed, waiting for a future that its author could not possibly have imagined. With the closing of Clara's diary, the narrative shifts from the intensely personal and subjective to the cold, impersonal lens of public record. The consequences of the events of that stormy night are not found in emotional testimony, but in the dry, bureaucratic language of legal documents, census records, and personal correspondence. The story of what truly happened at Hollingswood was buried with Abner in the mire, and in its place, a new, officially sanctioned fiction was constructed, one that served to obscure the truth and maintain the social order. The first of these documents is a report from the Chatham County Magistrate, dated November 5, 1832. It officially declares Abner Hollings lost and presumed dead. The report meticulously details the facts of the case as they were presented. A valuable slave boy had run off during the Great Storm. Mr. Hollings, a man known for his diligent protection of his property, had bravely gone out in pursuit. Tragically, he never returned. The storm was blamed for his demise, the swamp for concealing his body. It was deemed a terrible accident, a testament to the dangers of the untamed Georgia lowcountry. The next piece of the official narrative comes from a letter discovered in a Savannah archive, written by a distant aunt, a Mrs. Eleanor Prentice. Dated November 20th, the letter expresses her profound sorrow over the ghastly tragedy and makes arrangements for the poor, orphaned Hollings sisters to be removed from the site of their grief and brought to live with her in Savannah. The letter speaks of Clara and Annabeth as fragile, traumatized victims, a portrayal that effectively sealed their silence and removed them from any further inquiry. They vanished from Chatham County, their first-hand knowledge of the truth safely sequestered. The economic consequences for Hollingswood are chronicled in the county tax and property records. Without its obsessive, tyrannical master, the plantation, which had been a model of productivity, quickly fell into decline. The records from 1833 to 1840 show the gradual sale of its land parcels, the piecemeal liquidation of its enslaved population. Families that had been at Hollingswood for generations were broken up and scattered across the state, their shared secret history dispersed with them, ensuring the full story could never be reassembled. This dispersal of the enslaved community was a strategic, if unintentional, final act of erasure. The oral history that Hetty had shared with Nathaniel, the collective memory of Abner's crimes, was atomized. The men and women who had participated in or witnessed the events of that night carried their secrets with them to new plantations, new masters, their silence guaranteed by the instinct for survival. To speak of what they knew would have been a death sentence, and so the truth went with them to their graves. However, a different kind of legacy began to take root in the local folklore of the region. While the official story spoke of a tragic accident, a new, darker legend emerged, passed down in hushed tones in the slave quarters of neighboring plantations, and eventually among the poor white and Gullah communities that lived on the fringes of the swamp. They began to speak of the Hollings Mire, a cursed section of the swamp, a place where the land itself held a grudge. The legend told of a cruel plantation master who was so evil that the earth itself opened up and swallowed him whole. Some versions of the story claimed that on stormy nights you could still see his lantern flickering deep within the swamp, a ghost light forever searching for something it could never reclaim. This piece of folklore was the last distorted echo of the truth, a myth that held a kernel of the historical reality, a testament to the fact that some stories are too powerful to be completely erased. The physical legacy of Hollingswood was one of entropy and decay. The manor house stood abandoned for years, its windows broken, its paint peeling, a local landmark of tragedy and ruin. It was eventually torn down in the late 1880s. The fields were sold off, absorbed into other properties. By the turn of the 20th century, the name Hollingswood had largely faded from the official maps of Chatham County, its location known only to a few local historians and the descendants of those who had once been enslaved there. The final documented consequence is one of silence. There were no further investigations, no deathbed confessions, no challenges to the official story. The disappearance of Abner Hollings became a closed case, a footnote in the history of a great storm. The system, which had been so horrifically exploited by Abner, moved on, its machinery of power and forgetting grinding forward. The truth, it seemed, had been successfully buried, destined to remain a secret kept by a forgotten diary, a scattered community, and a haunted stretch of Georgia swamp. The story of Hollingswood Plantation, reconstructed from the fragile pages of Clara's diary and the cold fragments of public record, does not offer the clean resolution of a legal verdict. It presents us with a more complicated and unsettling form of justice, one that operates outside the boundaries of law and is recorded only in secret testimony and lingering folklore. The diaries of Clara and Eleanor Hollings, now housed in the Georgia State Archive, remain a subject of intense academic debate, artifacts that challenge the comfortable narratives of the Old South. Some historians argue that the diaries are a record of profound psychological distress, the writings of two isolated and tormented women, and that Abner Hollings was likely nothing more than a strict but conventional patriarch who fell victim to a tragic accident. They point to the lack of any corroborating evidence in the official records, the absence of any public accusation. To them, the story of a systematic breeding program is a Gothic fantasy, a fiction created to cope with an unbearable reality. This view preserves the integrity of the official record, keeping the comfortable lies of the past intact. Others, however, argue that the absence of official evidence is, in itself, evidence of the crime. The power structure of the antebellum South was designed precisely to make crimes like Abner's untraceable, to render his victims voiceless and their testimony inadmissible. They argue that the meticulous detail of the diaries, the consistency of their internal logic, and their alignment with the known brutalities of the slave system lend them a powerful, undeniable authenticity. In this interpretation, the diaries are a rare and precious record of the truth, a testament to the courage of the women who dared to write it down. The fate of the protagonists adds to the ambiguity. After being sent to Savannah, Clara and Annabeth Hollings vanish from the historical record. There is no record of their marriage, their death, or their life beyond their aunt's home. Some speculate they lived out quiet, secluded lives, forever haunted by their secret. Others imagine a more hopeful end, that they used their inheritance to move north, to start new lives under new names, finally free from the shadow of their father. Their silence, like the silence of the swamp, keeps its secrets well. The same is true of Nathaniel. There is no record of a slave by that name ever being sold from the Hollingswood estate after Abner's death. He too simply disappears. It is possible he was among those sold and scattered, his identity lost in the churn of the slave trade. But a more compelling narrative emerges from the oral histories of the era. Stories of a resourceful and intelligent man who helped establish a clandestine route for runaway slaves, a quiet leader who used his knowledge and courage to guide others to freedom. This story, though unverified, persists as his most powerful legacy. The most tangible and unsettling piece of this unresolved history emerged in 1987. a U.S. Geological Survey team conducting an environmental study on wetland subsidence in Chatham County took a series of deep core samples from the area historically known as the Hollingswood Plantation. One of these samples, extracted from a deep peat layer within the boundaries of what was once the Hollings Mire, contained something unexpected: fragmented human skeletal remains. Forensic analysis confirmed the bones were those of a Caucasian male, and radiocarbon dating placed them squarely in the early 19th century, with a high probability between 1820 and 1840. The acidic, low-oxygen environment of the peat bog had preserved them, but also degraded them to a point where positive identification was impossible. The official report deemed the discovery anomalous and historically inconclusive. The bones were catalogued, archived, and the case was once again closed. And so the final question remains, hanging in the humid Georgia air. Was the disappearance of Abner Hollings a tragic accident, a story twisted by the grief and delusion of his daughters? Or do those anonymous bones, still resting in a sterile archive box, represent the final material evidence of a perfect, untraceable act of justice? The diaries offer one answer, the official records another. Perhaps the truest answer lies somewhere in between, in the dark, peaty soil of the swamp, which accepted a secret it has yet to fully surrender. The archives of history are filled with stories that have been deliberately silenced, voices that have been buried under the weight of official narratives. A date before the story, we believe that exhuming these truths is not just an act of remembrance, but an act of justice. The story of Hollingswood is a reminder that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones who write the history books. If you believe that these forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and that the darkest corners of our past hold the most important lessons, then join our mission. Subscribe to our channel and be the first to know when a new chapter of our hidden history is opened. Thank you for bearing witness with us tonight.